Welcome to New Rechts. My name is Daniel de Liever, and today we're going to talk about, you could say, the gender agenda of the European Union. And to discuss this topic again, I am glad to talk to Ashley Frawley. I guess most people will know you by now. This is, I think, the third time we have had a talk on New Rechts. So thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And I assume most people know a little bit more about your background already from the last few talks we had. You are a sociologist who focuses on, at this point, quite a lot of issues. Yes, first time we talked about family, then we talked about euthanasia, and now about, you could say, the whole gender ideology. I'm looking forward to it, but if people want to know more specifically about your background, we'll just link it in the conversation, and you can also listen to our other conversations. But for people that don't know, you recently wrote a report for MCC Brussels about this topic. Let's just dive in. I would say let's start with what actually is gender, because people might be even confused with this. And if you're going to talk about all the details, maybe this would be a good place to start.
Yeah, so gender kind of has a really long history as a word. It originates in the middle of the 20th century, actually, interestingly, with psychologists who were working with gender nonconforming young people. And it was a way to differentiate between biological sex and socially constructed gender roles. And that all sounds quite woke now, but the interesting thing is that those psychologists were interested in developing therapies to get those gender non-conforming people to act more like their biological sex. So it was actually trying to align them. So it's very similar actually to the trans agenda at the moment, except that rather than using psychological tools to get the person's psychology to align with supposed accepted or expected gender roles, it's getting the body to align with the sort of preferred gender roles that the person wishes to embody, or the way that the person wishes to be perceived as society. Like they want someone to look at this person and say, oh well, that is a woman, that is a man, and that obviously involves socially accepted, to whatever extent, gender roles. So this word gender came into the feminist lexicon in the 70s and 80s as a way to differentiate again between sex and gender. So, but the core argument was that there's nothing about one's biological sex that necessarily means that they will or must take on particular gender roles. And it was about sort of a key part of a lot of this campaigning. And I even remember, like in the early 2000s, there was like this website that was like, oh, there are lots of ways of being a girl. You can climb trees if you want. And there are lots of ways of being a boy. You can be an effeminate boy. That's fine. And that was kind of the general thrust of it, was this idea that we're fighting against these stereotypical expectations that were attached to biological sex, and in particular the expectations that were associated with women. And obviously that goes all the way back to the very roots of the movement for women's rights. You could go back to the Enlightenment, with as early as the late 18th century or into the 19th century, of liberal thinkers like John Stuart Mill, who start saying, well, there's nothing about the biological makeup of a woman that necessarily means that she's going to be inferior. Take her out of domestic drudgery and so on, and you'll see that there are no limitations. And he's arguing, men will say, oh, women can't do X, Y, and Z because of their biology. But when they say they can't do it, they're admitting that they shouldn't do it because they can't biologically. They're admitting that that they are actually trying to hold them back from doing it. If it was just that our biological constitution meant we couldn't do something, you wouldn't need to hold women back at all. So that was sort of the basis. And I remember that I used to, when I was, lecturing at Swansea University, where I was for 10 years, I, year after year, I would teach, gender and the history of the feminist movement and blah, blah, blah. And I'd have a slide up from Aaron Reich in English, a quote from Aaron Reich in English that said, discrimination against women must necessarily rely on the one thing that differentiates us from men, our biology. And as the years went on, I had more and more trans students in my class, and I became more and more uncomfortable having that slide up. And it dawned on me that I would have to erase the history of the feminist movement to make room for this new obsession with gender. So gender has come up, and which I explain in the report, through this long sort of history of piggybacking on women's rights. The understanding of gender became sort of expanded to include genders, not both genders, genders, all genders. So even if you look at like the Wikipedia page for gender mainstreaming, which all EU countries sign up to, it now says all genders. But in the 1997 Amsterdam Treaty, which encoded or that commitment to gender mainstream amongst all member states, it was about men and women. Gender functioned as a shorthand for women. That's what it was. It was when we talked about gender equality, we were talking about women. So what happened was, by expanding, and this is a long sort of story here, it's very difficult to kind of truncate, but in academia, you had these movements for intersectionality. You had these movements that were trying to gradually kind of separate gender from sex, so that gender gradually came to be prioritized over sex, and sex even became something, gender became something that even preceded sex, and sex was something that was imposed on the body. And that's where you get this idea of like assigned sex at birth. Like, oh, what might it be? I'll just assign it randomly kind of idea that you get. But the reason for that was because there was this idea in academia that you had all of these gender norms that preceded the individual, that are then attached to the individual at birth. So gender actually precedes the individual, and then it becomes a system of expectations that the person is socialized into. So that was the sort of idea, but that opened the door to prioritizing gender over sex. So what has happened now is that, ironically, because this movement was something that initially said, look, there's nothing about me as a woman that necessarily means I'm going to be, like, I don't know, close to nature, like emotional, erratic, all these things that were very insulting, that were used as excuses to keep women out of public life, that women kind of fought against. All of that has now been reified. It's been sort of made real, where it's like, that is gender. That is what a woman is, gender. And that is what a woman is. And if you're not that, then you must be something else. So what was that whole movement that was trying to kind of change that idea is now like, no, that's actually great. And you can sort of identify in and out of it. But one wonders why, generations of women who were abused and treated very poorly didn't simply identify out of their bad situations. Yeah. They couldn't. So anyway, sex is obviously biology, gender is the social rules. But what has happened is that gender has come to trump sex. And we're seeing, a report that was released from UCL today, where even in our official statistics, gender identity has come to supplant sex, so that it becomes very difficult to actually see what is going on here, what's going on with crime statistics, what's going on with like cancer, and the significance of the biological body becomes reduced more and more. And that is, as I explain in the report, the result of concerted campaigning by activists who were pushing at an open door of institutions, institutions who themselves wanted, for a variety of reasons we can talk about, to undermine gender roles.
I think maybe before we go into that, it's ironic, right? In the sense of going full circle, but there's still a lot of people. Of course, I'm coming at this from the Dutch perspective, and I think a lot of people are like, okay, maybe this exists, maybe this might be an academic problem. A lot of people still have this attitude of, why should I care? So why do you think people actually should care in Western countries about what's going on with gender?
Well, if you care about, for one thing, it might seem like a distant issue, but if you, and actually part of the reason why people didn't care is because it was bundled into a variety of policies in a very clandestine way. So, women's rights, if you talk about gender equality, like, okay, yeah, that's like motherhood and apple pie, all good. I don't care, sure. Or like
Hmm.
the rights of gays and lesbians. It was like, yeah, I mean, it doesn't affect me. Why not? And so that's kind of how it became really powerful. And in fact, many people who are part of this or are familiar with this debate will know about a famous document that was produced by Iglio and Denton's law firm in 2019 that explicitly recommended to activist groups, keep your campaigning out of the public eye. Keep your campaigning out of the public eye. Bundle it in with agendas that have popularity, because they knew
Hmm.
what they wanted was very unpopular. But at face value, they sold it as just like another kind of gay. So people didn't care. And then all of a sudden, their kids are coming home saying, "Oh, in school today, we learned about the genderbread man." Sorry, the genderbread person, which was then superseded by the gender unicorn, which was a bright, colorful picture of a unicorn with all an array of sexualities and genders that you could choose from, that were all portrayed in this wonderful way. And this will make you really, really special. And their kids are coming home saying, like, "Oh, I don't, perhaps I'm not really a girl. I don't really like wearing dresses. Perhaps I'm not really a girl." Or, as is happening in Portugal, the schools were allowing the students, and it's happening in lots of places, but Portugal is just one example, where the schools will allow the students to socially transition without telling the family. So you don't know that this has happened until you go into a parent-teacher meeting and they're calling your daughter by a male name. Or when you go into the doctor's office and the doctor says, and these are real cases, the doctor suddenly, you think you're helping your child and doing the right thing. The doctor looks right past you at the child and says, "Don't worry, you don't need your parents' permission to go on hormone treatment." That's when you care. That's when you care. So
Hmm.
all of this was happening, and like when you can't get decent statistics, you want to find out what's actually happening in a country. One of the more absurd cases was, there was a BBC article, I think it was BBC, a few years ago. The headline was like, "Why do we have this stereotype that women can't be violent? Our statistics show that in recent years there's been an uptick in women engaging in violent crimes and sexual crimes." And it was like an incredible exercise in delusion, because we all know why that was. It's because they were recording biological men as women, and biological men have a different risk and offending profile than women do. And the
Yeah.
craziest thing was that I feel like actually the journalist might have been sort of bound and gagged, but was kind of winking at us, because one of the pictures in the article was clearly a trans woman. so, so the person was like, "Yeah, why do we have this? Women can be violent too." And there's a picture of a trans woman. So that's why people should care.
I think it's a good point. If this wasn't so serious, it is also very funny in a bizarre way, because it's so absurd what's happening. But even what's more absurd is, and that's what you reported on, is that our tax money is literally going into funding this and promoting it. That is what to me has been quite shocking. I think for a lot of people, what happens in the European Union is kind of far away. It's already quite a challenge to keep up with your own national politics, and there's much less coverage of what's happening in Europe. So I think it's good to go into this. Let's start with how actually has the European Union changed its view on gender to support this agenda?
So, as I mentioned before, one of the first ways that that this ideology has made its way into policy is through a redefinition of gender to mean all genders. Gender mainstreaming is as I mentioned before, is a key part of EU policy. That is, that all policies all policies across all member states have to think about the effect that they will have on the relationship between men and women. In other words, female gender inequality. So, and that is something that makes its way all the way through all policymaking. So what has happened is that by redefining gender to mean all these different genders, to be something that you can identify into and out of, by default, countries now have a responsibility to think about how their policies affect trans people in particular. So it becomes de facto trans inclusive without any kind of debate at all. And people didn't even know about it until they found themselves having to bend to its will. It was too late. So one of the best examples of this is the EU's gender equality strategy, 2020-2025, which is going to be replaced soon, probably with another strategy that is equally captured. I'm certain. And this strategy was produced with the active participation of these LGBTIQ gender identity groups, which have themselves been captured. So again, you have this at a certain moment in the 90s and the early 2000s across the world, what had been LGB groups gradually were overtaken by, or sorry, they started to include the TIQ and then the expanding kind of list after that. Part of the reason for that is the need to sort of refresh the agenda, to keep funding coming. You, as an NGO, as an activist, you're always looking to refresh your claims, to have the most expansive definitions, because it means more people will potentially be affected by your issue. And that means it's more important. That's just one example and one reason. But what happened was, once, already by the 1990s, amongst EU policymakers, there was this sense that the gender agenda in terms of women's rights was stale. It wasn't sexy anymore. And so they were very receptive then to the LGB agenda as a way of refreshing that. And the LGB agenda was very much portrayed in the same kind of light as women's rights, as was the TIQ, which was like bodily autonomy and questioning of gender roles and all these sorts of things. It was the same kind of narrative that was being used. And then, of course, the TIQ, in terms of like medical transition, same kinds of ideas, because in order to change your legal gender in many countries, you needed to go through medical transition, which often involves sterilization. And so they questioned whether or not you need to do that on the basis of on the basis of bodily autonomy, the same arguments that have been successful for women. The trouble with that is that while that sounds quite good, right? Like, why force people in order to change their gender to undergo medical, like really profound medical changes to their bodies? On the other hand, changing your gender wanting to be perceived by the world as that sex, which for some people required medical transitioning. So if you got rid of that, all of a sudden this whole idea of like what it means to change gender became very nebulous and strange, and you had to kind of default to this weird idea that everybody has a gender identity, like a gendered soul. And if I just feel my gendered soul to be this way, then society has to kind of bend to my will. So at least there was actually a little bit of coherence, coercive though it was, to the earlier legal gender change that required some form of medical transition, because there's a recognition, okay, well, this person wants so badly to be perceived by society as this sex that, we'll offer you this certificate if you've gone through such a process. But now they don't. Now, no, it's just like the push is for gender self-ID. So to simply identify as a gender that you wish, with very few, if any, legal, medical, or psychiatric impediments. And that is enshrined by the EU in their, well, it's non-legally binding, but in the LGBTIQ equality strategy, they say that. The EU says this, that they're going to push member states to adopt legal gender change policies with as little legal, medical, or psychiatric impediments as possible at any age. And they're very, very, and the lobby groups that have pushed for this, that have sort of been captured by the gender identity agenda and have actually subordinated LGB, they define now same-sex attraction is now same gender attraction, and that's also in the LGBTIQ equality strategy. They have been pushing for this self-ID, with no impediments at any age, and they are very, very critical and mistrustful of families. They really you see this in so many issues. You talked about this many times. They see the family as an impediment to getting what they want, because darn it, those families seem to have all these attachments that make it difficult to get the policies that they desire. So they will talk, there's trans activists that differentiate between parents who accept transition and so-called parents who do not. And they advocate for third-party interventions for parents who refuse to accept transition. And so, all of this is very much embedded in policy because these groups are embedded in the policymaking process, having gone through and usurped the women's rights agenda and the LGBT agenda. And the EU funds them to do this. They're stationed in Brussels. They're on the expert groups. They're writing the policies.
It's kind of crazy. And how you say they're funding it? How much money are we approximately talking about that is spent on this?
So I have made some rather conservative calculations. I could have played fast and loose because our opponents play fast and loose with the numbers all the time. They're like, oh yeah, as big a number as possible. But I've made some conservative estimates. So I think probably the most expansive number that I have is that the EU is spending at least 221 million, giving 221 million euros to NGOs that promote gender identity ideology. So what does that mean? It means that they have subtly redefined sex to refer to gender, that they are actively involved in LGBTIQ campaigns, and they are ambivalent. At least like the European Women's Lobby has tried kind of to like be ambivalent, but some of their core members have made statements about, that transphobia has no place in the women's movement, all these sorts of things. So they have that ideology that there is a thing called gender identity and that this is an important thing is through all of these groups. And I could have added more because it's like its tentacles are everywhere, but those are the ones I'm quite sure of. And then, but 40.5 million euros of that has gone to the most radical transgender advocacy groups like ILGA Europe, IGLIO, Transgender Europe, that push the most radical vision of this born in the wrong body ideology. But beyond that, 65 million euros has gone to ILGA's international arm. So that's ILGA World. So the EU is putting a ton of money into these organizations that are pushing this stuff around the world, their kids are coming home in South Africa talking about this stuff. Why? Because ILGA World is developing materials. So that's just the money that's going there. Then we have research. Again, another conservative number, 26 million euros is being used to fund activist-driven research to promote gender identity ideology. That's in addition to the 221 million for NGOs. And these are research projects with names like, oh gosh, what was it? EU for Queers. Hold on, let me pull some of these up.
While you're doing that, you say that these are quite radical groups, and maybe I think a lot of our listeners and readers will not have heard of most of these groups. I would say almost thank God for that. But how radical are we talking about that these groups are that EU is funding with all these millions of euros?
Sorry, can you say that again?
I said a lot of these groups that you're naming, I assume that luckily a lot of our listeners have never heard of. So you said some of them are quite radical. So when you say radical, how radical are we actually talking about?
So one example being IGLIO. IGLIO is the one that produced that report so obviously ILGA is like the big one. It's it's like the mermaids. I'm not sure if you've come across mermaids, but if you are in the UK, you'd be familiar with mermaids, which was like the group that was very successful in pushing the trans agenda before anybody realized what the heck was going on in the UK. They were like secretly giving chest binders to children and it came out that some of their, they've sort of retreated from history with their tail between their legs after, it was revealed that some of their top people were involved in like child abuse and just really child abuse images, I think, and just really horrible things. And that doesn't necessarily reflect badly on the organization, but it's not a good look. But they were doing a lot of underhanded things directly. Like, I mean, one person's sexual proclivities, discussing sexual proclivities aside, they were genuinely giving like chest binders to kids and that kind of thing. Anyways, but ILGA is the big one. It's quite a lot like mermaids, but IGLIO is the youth arm of that. And they produced a document called Only for Adults. And it was looking at the successes, because these are sort of conglomerations of a lot of smaller groups, and they were looking at a lot of the successes of different groups around Europe, and their explicit goal was to get gender self-ID, medical treatment for transition for children. And they saw this as just a completely normal thing and something that they were trying to get passed in a lot of countries as clandestinely as possible. So yeah, you never heard of these groups. Why? Well, ILGA Europe asked specifically during the European elections, asked would-be MEPs to sign a pledge promising to keep their activities in relation to gender identity secret from the public. And over 1,000 MEPs signed, or would-be MEPs signed.
That's crazy. That is extremely undemocratic, right? We're already talking about an institution in the European Union, the European Parliament, that is already quite hard to keep track of. But the fact that people actively try to keep information on the public, that is definitely insane. The
reason why they evade democracy in this way is because, first of all, they know that what they want is not popular, and most people will not accept it. And this I've seen, you mentioned at the start that I work on quite a lot of issues, but the reason I work on quite a lot of issues is because my expertise is in social problems and social policy and in the policy process. So that's my interest in these are all case studies for me. And one thing that I have been noticing is the way that more and more groups are doing this. They are explicitly evading public debate and going straight to sympathetic policymakers and pushing things through, because they know once something is in law, it is very, very difficult to roll it back. It's the tendencies to expand. It's extremely undemocratic because they know what they want is unpopular. But they also think that the general public is just too stupid and too backward, and that is why they target children in education, because they think you need to re-educate people, that you need to educate children, you need to get children from a very young age, because once they become adults, they're lost. And this is one area of common ground that they have with EU policymakers, and that one of the major reasons why policymakers think there are social problems, why we have persistent problems, is because of us. Because we are stupid, our behaviors are wrong, we make the wrong choices, and the democracy is something that is more democratic the more isolated and insulated it is from the stupid demos. And that's why these people gravitate to the EU, because it is isolated. Nobody cares about what happens at the EU level. So they have direct access to policymakers where they can change culture. And that's that explicit goal. And it's the explicit goal of the EU, where they want to push so-called EU values. They find this common ground there. They latch onto that agenda, and then they try to change culture from the top down. Because you're wrong, you're stupid, you're too traditional, you need your culture changed, and then you will make the right choices, and then they will be able to solve problems. Which is completely wrong. That's not where social problems are incredibly complex. Most people are reasonable, even if they make the wrong choices. Like, hundreds of millions of people making a particular choice tells you there's some reason there's some push, there's something that's going on. And instead of trying to understand that, they say, oh, people are so stupid, people are so irrational, we need to get into the education system and change them.
Yeah, I would also say that you can call it education, or you can call it indoctrination. I think that would be a more appropriate way to call it. How successful, you say, are they actually? Because you say they are influencing the European culture, and of course then also the policy. You say you focus on the policy. What can people expect now? What are we up against when it comes to the impact they've had on policy, and what do you expect in this new agenda that will come? You say it also will probably be captured, but you also see in Europe now some pushback, right, from people who vote on more right-wing parties, not only, but also because of these kind of issues where people are afraid that it will influence their children even more.
Yeah, so they use a lot of different tools to pressure governments to fall in line. One of these is strategic litigation. And again, the EU funds this litigation. So if you that's a very powerful way of pressuring, at least, even if you can't directly. So we have the principle of subsidiarity, right? So there are a huge range of areas in which the member states are supposed to have sovereignty. So you're supposed to have sovereignty over education. You're supposed to have sovereignty over your family policy, all of that kind of stuff. And that is like the thorn in the side of these NGOs and policymakers. So they're always trying to evade this, which is pretty simple, because any area of policy is just incredibly complex and is going to have overlapping kind of aspects of, like, you know, freedom of movement and economy and all these. So there are ways where you can get kind of slimy and start making these arguments, which they do. And this is like the parenthood certificate is one example of this, where they're forcing cross-border recognition of families and gender changes and so on, and you know, people's birth certificates and all of that, a member state does not recognize as a family, but because of freedom of movement, they kind of pressure them to accept this, to recognize a parenthood as a family, something that was recognized in another member state. But the other one that I was sort of beginning to talk about was strategic litigation. So you can take cases to the European Court of Human Rights and make anybody who's a signatory to that kind of recognize this. And at the very least, you can force some kind of policy change at the member state level. So this is what they were doing with assisted dying through strategic litigation. The idea was not that you could harmonize policy from the top down, but rather force countries to adopt explicit policy in the area. And if you force the countries to adopt explicit policy, you can then campaign in those countries to push the explicit policy toward accepting euthanasia. That's how they were successful in Canada, for example. It was through strategic litigation. So they'll use strategic litigation, and the EU funds that. The EU funds and gives the tools and the know-how and all of this stuff necessary to the tune of millions of euros to these groups so that they can engage in strategic litigation and therefore bypass subsidiarity in member states. And then they use pressures in terms of funding. Like, we're not going to release this funding if you do not recognize our democracy, the rule of law, equality, blah, blah, blah. And what they mean by that is LGBTIQ. Now, there has been a ton of pushback in terms of member states and when they start to realize what's going on. But again, as I said, it's too late because it's already in policy. Now, that doesn't mean you can't have any effect. That's what we're trying to do here. But one thing that has been very successful is, recall that I said from the very beginning, there's been a lot of piggybacking on women's rights and on LGB, because most people are like, yeah, whatever, you know, you want to be gay, that's fine. Like, I don't care. It's got nothing to do with me, you know? And so if they can kind of piggyback on this, or like, you know, most people believe in, to a certain extent, women's equality, whatever that means in practice is open to debate. But these are things that are like, you know, headline, we're pretty much okay with in society. And so what they do is they then say, these groups are anti-gender. There's an anti-gender movement. And what they're saying there is they're painting you with this weird reactionary brush where they're like, you hate women. Because what do most people understand when you hear gender? They understand women. So if you say you're anti-gender, it's like, oh, these people hate women's rights. And in fact, one of the tactics being used, in fact, against us in Brussels this week when we had some presentations on this, was spreading a rumor that this group, they're anti-women's rights, they're anti-abortion, come join us in protest. So that's what they try to say. And what I want to tell people is, don't take the bait. Don't take the bait. This is the thing that bothers me with a lot of movements. Like, the right will say that the left is all this stuff, which the left had never been. And then the left will say, yeah, so what? Or the left will say that the right is about all this stuff. And they'll be like, yeah, so what? No, people, have some freaking principles. Have some principles. What does it mean to hold the political positions that you do? Okay? Don't just react to what you think, or don't just sort of say, take the slurs at face value and say, yes, that is what I am. Because no, you know, I have been speaking to a lot of conservatives. We just had a meeting with a lesbian feminist and a feminist founder of GenSpect in Brussels with these conservative groups who were fighting for women's rights. Now, people will say, oh, that's a cover for other things that they want, blah, blah, blah. But who is standing up for women's rights? These groups, okay? So when you were saying, like, when people are trying to paint this movement as anti-gender, they're trying to say, you hate all gay people, you hate women. No, maybe some people do. Maybe some groups are totally anti-LGB. But, and it's such a wonderful slur because most people aren't. Most people are actually quite accepting of how people live their lives. But most people are also realizing that gender identity is not just another way to be gay. It has profound impacts on women's rights. It has profound impacts on how we record our statistics, who we allow into women's refuges, into women's bathrooms. And like another big part of it is a lot of women don't want to be forced to play along with male sexual fantasies. And that's like a huge thing you're not supposed to say. And I don't know what percentage of people who want to transition do it because they have a kind of sexual proclivity, but it's certain that some do. And definitely. I don't want to have to play along. I don't want to be, I am sick of it. Like a lot of women are sick of like, that's why you join feminism. You're sick of saying yes to men. And this just became another way of forcing women to say yes to men. Because like there's a one of these sort of stereotypes that women, that feminists had fought against was of women as being passive, emotional, body conscious, protectorates of morality, risk averse, heteronomous. That is like, you're not autonomous. You look always for like procedures and someone else to tell you what to do and how to feel. And then yes, oh yes. And you're very compliant and so on. And the women who are standing up against this, they're breaking that. They are deviant because they refuse to accommodate. They refuse to accommodate. And as a woman, you're supposed to be accommodating. And then they're also deviant. So they get punished twice because they are refusing to accept the new religion. So it's women that are getting cast out of society. Anyway, so don't take that bait, don't take that bait and say, yeah, I am anti-gender. And then say the whole gender identity, all gender equality stuff is all BS. No, not necessarily. Yes. Okay. And also on another issue, we talked about this with family. I do think like the actual women's gender agenda has a lot of problems. And in particular, some of the things that I've just said, in that it implicitly reifies this kind of feminine, and part of the reason why they love it is because they want pliant, feminized subjects. They're like, actually, ladies, all that stuff you were fighting against, all those stereotypes, they're actually great. We love you're emotional. We love that you're close to nature. Men, you should be like that too. No. It's a bit like the racism. Like they used to say all these horrible things about Black people, and they're like, oh no. Everybody's stupid. Everybody, no. Everybody's reasonable. Everybody's rational. Let us all come into the glory of enlightenment subjectivity. That's what we want. But instead, it like knocks everybody down. So I do think there's problems with the gender agenda in terms of its relationship to women. But these are two separate things. You are not necessarily anti-gender because you are questioning gender identity. So I think movements would be a lot more successful. And I think that the most successful movements have been the ones that have specifically said, it's this gender identity pseudoscientific religion that we are fighting against, and the effects that it's having on women and on children and on our society.
It's a good point. Yeah, the thing about the children, I think, is also good to emphasize. Like we already said, it heavily impacts women. It also heavily impacts children, because if we already accept in society that they are unable to make long-term impactful decisions, right? We don't allow them to vote, to drink, to drive a car, etc. All these things that could have a potential big impact, but we do allow them to actually castrate themselves, make very, let's say, intense changes to their bodies that, first of all, have not been studied appropriately, but second of all, they don't even know what they're saying yes to, of course. If you're a 13-year-old, you don't know if you want to be a parent most of the time. So I think you made some good points here. Are you hopeful that actually we are going to see these changes, that movements are starting to pick these things up, and that we can fight what's happening now on a European level?
Yeah, I am optimistic that we can make some changes, or we can at least put the brakes on, now that a lot of this stuff has seen the light of day. The EU responded to my report, and so they are watching. They are worried, and they said, oh, well, all of this is transparent. Sure. Is it though? Yeah, you can look up the numbers, but we had to make some requests for exactly who's writing these policies, what was the involvement, whose opinions are you actually putting into these documents. I mean, you can guess based on the involvement in the groups and that sort of thing, but a lot of it is it's not debated in the public. Not a lot of it, all of it. None of it is debated in the public sphere, and it's all happened behind a smokescreen of women's rights and gay rights. When it is, we're talking about like pressuring lesbians into having sex with men. that is messed up. That's not gay rights,
Yeah.
okay? Like, and I'm not saying like policy says you must have sex with men, but by redefining same-sex attraction as same gender attraction, you know, you are making it much more difficult. Like I talk about it in the report, like a lesbian dating app that was shut down because it was trying to keep men off of it. You know, or like lesbians who are just trying to meet other lesbians, which is hard enough. And you're being forced to accept men into your spaces. And like, again, our accommodation and our kindness that we're supposed to have is being weaponized against us. Aren't you supposed to be nice? I remember there was like a group of trans men, you know, women who want to be perceived as men, who tried to get into a gay men's group, and the gay men were like, no. And they were like, okay. And that was it. That was the end of it. Whereas like with men, because they're socialized as men, right? And they're using female socialization where they're like strong arming their way in. And a lot of women are like, oh, okay. And they're not okay with it. But we all have to pretend. And there's a lot of women that go along with this. And I have to say, like, this is really embarrassing, but I will say, like, I was too worried to speak out while I was in a permanent position at a university, because I had a lot of trans students, right? And they were good people. They were great students. I love them, and I feel terrible. I don't want to hurt them. I think right now about one student. If you watch this, I know. I think about this student all the time. How great she was and how smart she was, and it's not her fault. It's not their fault that they got pulled into this. And actually, so I didn't want to hurt them. You know, I didn't want to speak out, and just slowly, I couldn't anymore. I couldn't stay quiet anymore, and I was starting to get denounced from my colleagues and all these sorts of things. You know, I actually don't have a problem if you want to like wear a dress as a man, whatever, you know, but it's crazy because it's actually really bigoted, because this movement can't say, oh, that's a man wearing a dress. All right. They have to be like, oh no, I only see a beautiful woman. It's a woman. Always has been a woman. Like they cannot deal with this idea that a man might wish to dress as a woman. And actually that's like the old trans rights movement. That's all that they wanted, was like people not to like be absolutely horrified by this idea of a man wearing a dress. Now, there are lots of reasons to be horrified, and maybe we could have a debate about that, but we're not. We all have to pretend something literal has happened. You literally become a woman. That's crazy. And that's actually extremely backward and bigoted.
For sure. And the irony is, if you look at, for example, women's sports, you now have the best women athletes are men. This is like going full circle on it. It is, you can say even there are even some beauty contests where you could say the most beautiful woman is now a man. So it is indeed it is
so crazy.
Yes.
You have like an effeminate boy, and you're like, "Oh, Johnny, you want to wear a dress? Guess you're a girl now. Guess we'll call you Jane." Like you can imagine a horrible person saying, "No." Now society's like, "Yeah, I guess we will call you Jane." Like it's completely mad.
I think that that's a good point to finish our conversation here. If people want to follow your work, where can they do that?
So I'm on X as at Ashley A. Frawley, and that's my my handle on every platform. And I'm on Patreon as well, where I release lectures and long form essays and all sorts of things. If you're interested in going in more depth.
Thank you very much for this. And also, of course, thank you for our listeners to listening to this conversation. If you want to make these kind of conversations possible, please consider subscribing at nieuwrechts.nl. And see you in the next one.